50. It's a stark, raw number, isn't it? And to be clear, that is not an estimate. That is a documented count. But what exactly does it represent?
Well, that striking statistic is the number of deaths in ICE immigrant detention centers since January 2025. This data comes straight from a massive recent Reuters analysis, and honestly, it's the perfect gateway into our deep dive today. We're going to unpack a huge surge of reporting coming from investigative journalists, federal courts, and government watchdogs.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at the ICE files, accountability and abuse in immigration detention. Now, my goal here isn't to tell you what to think, right? Instead, we're going to structure the facts, the data, and the documented realities so you can really wrap your head around what's happening inside this sprawling federal system.
To break all this down logically, we're going to hit 4 core pillars today. First, the detention surge. Second, inside the facilities. Third, the corporate connection. And finally, clashes, protests, and dissent.
So let's kick things off with part 1, the detention surge, looking at the macro picture of recent ICE operations. Now, what's really interesting here is the massive shift revealed by Reuters. The death rate in ICE detention has literally more than doubled under recent administration policies. And their investigation didn't just stop at counting the deaths. It actually pointed to specific, documented issues. We're talking allegations of medical neglect, inadequate mental health care, delayed emergency responses, and a serious lack of transparency in how these death reports are even handled.
But the search isn't just about what happens inside the centers. It's about who's being brought into them and how. An investigation published by The Guardian looked at ICE street arrests in New York and New Jersey and found that a staggering 93% of those arrests targeted Latinos. This data is actually the foundation for multiple lawsuits right now, which allege that these targeted operations involve warrantless seizures, mistaken identity, and racial profiling of people just going about their daily lives. And then there's the ripple effect, 145,000. To put that into perspective, according to a Brookings Institution estimate, that is the staggering number of children who've been separated from their parents because of parental immigration detention just since the start of 2025. Because the federal government doesn't comprehensively track this specific metric, researchers basically had to piece this puzzle together to show us the sheer scale of family separation happening as a byproduct of this enforcement surge.
Which brings us to part 2, inside the facilities, where we zoom in and ground these statistics in human realities.
Because behind all those data points are real individual cases that have drawn some intense scrutiny from watchdogs. Take 19-year-old Royer Perez Jimenez. His death in an ICE jail really spotlighted the systemic dangers inside these facilities. Or consider Daffy Michelle, a Haitian woman released from ICE custody only to be found dead of hypothermia at a Pittsburgh bus shelter. The medical examiner officially ruled it a homicide, raising some major questions about how ICE handles releases for vulnerable people. Then there's Rodney Taylor, a double amputee recently released from custody who is publicly speaking out about the severe physical harm and medical neglect he says he experienced while locked up.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really profound disconnect. On one hand, you have the official administrative policy. According to the Associated Press, they recently revised detention standards specifically to reduce the burden on contractors, while also expanding electronic monitoring. But on the other hand, the reported realities for detainees inside places like the Dilley Family Center or Delaney Hall in New Jersey tell a completely different story. Allegations of medical neglect, moldy food, and the continuation of a highly controversial $1 a day forced labor program.
This whole environment has pretty much reached a boiling point. They have nothing else to lose. That quote, reported by The Guardian, perfectly captures the desperation that advocates say is driving massive hunger and labor strikes at facilities like Delaney Hall. When you have nearly 40 women signing on to a hunger strike just to demand basic medical care, safe conditions, and protection from abuse, well, it tells us that the internal grievance mechanisms, at least according to the detainees, are completely failing.
All right, let's zoom back out for part 3, the corporate connection, examining the systemic infrastructure.
The reports map out a deeply interconnected system here. Let's look at the leadership level first. The administration appointed David Ventrella, who is a former executive of the private prison company GEO Group, to actually lead ICE. Financially, investigations have flagged dark money flowing from ICE detention contractors straight to political super PACs connected to influential lawmakers. And when it comes to oversight, federal standards for these private contractors have been relaxed. Critics and lawmakers argue this creates a massive conflict of interest, where federal policy is essentially being shaped by the very private prison industry that profits from it.
So the crucial point here is this ongoing collision between profit and public accountability. On one side, private prison profits are absolutely surging, And we're seeing reports of immigrants being held in private ICE jails even after they've signed voluntary departure agreements. But on the flip side, transparency is shrinking fast. For instance, an internal memo literally ordered ICE to stop reporting the deaths of detainees who die shortly after being released. Plus, ICE has been caught trying to redact their rationale for detention from federal courts. Lawmakers are definitely waving a red flag here, warning that the profit motives of private contractors might be actively incentivizing this lack of transparency.
Moving on to our final section, Part 4, Clashes, Protests, and Dissent. Here, we're looking at the escalating crackdown on organizers.
As you might guess, the political pushback has been intense. Representative Jamie Raskin recently said, ICE is acting like a secret paramilitary police force for the president. That quote really hits the nail on the head regarding the growing alarm over ICE's use of masked agents, militarized raids, and this general perception that immigration enforcement is being wielded as a political weapon, totally bypassing standard law enforcement accountability.
But let's immediately ping-pong over to the federal government's perspective for a second. The administration's rationale is that state resistance is interference with federal immigration enforcement. Operating on that premise, the Department of Justice literally sued 4 states, Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Washington, simply because those states refused to issue undercover license plates to ICE agents. So the federal government clearly views local non-cooperation as a direct, active threat to their legal mandate.
And this friction has resulted in a documented federal crackdown on dissent. It's not just rhetoric, guys. 15 people, including Minnesota trade unionists, were recently indicted in what labor leaders are calling a clear effort to intimidate organizers. Over in Portland, an anti-ICE protester was sentenced to 30 months in prison following clashes. Down in California, immigration activists with the group VC Defensa accused federal agents of raiding their homes in a targeted intimidation campaign. And a federal judge actually recently upheld the conviction of former Judge Hannah Dugan, who activists argue was targeted specifically for her resistance to immigration raids.
Let's move through the timeline and see how this builds. We can chronologically map out the escalating tactics being deployed by federal enforcement to counter local resistance. First, memos were issued authorizing ICE officers to use administrative warrants, not judicial warrants, to enter homes. Second, as a pressure tactic against sanctuary policies, the Department of Homeland Security actually threatened to halt international flight and cargo processing at airports like Newark. And third, perhaps the most alarming one to civil rights groups, reports emerged of internal White House proposals to invoke the Insurrection Act and suspend habeas corpus specifically to handle anti-ICE protests.
We are looking at a system testing the absolute limits of its authority. I want to conclude this thematic breakdown with a quote from a federal judge. When ICE attempted to justify holding a detainee while simultaneously trying to hide its legal reasoning from the court through heavy redactions, the judge issued a stark warning. They called the practice repugnant to the rule of law. It's a really powerful reminder from the judiciary about why oversight is absolutely crucial.
Which leaves us right here. We've looked at the data, the conditions inside the facilities, the corporate money, and the clash in the streets. So, as this explainer wraps up, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. When a federal agency rapidly expands its power, relying heavily on private corporations and aggressively suppressing local dissent, where is the line drawn between national security and transparent accountability? It's a balance of power and human rights that will undoubtedly define the coming years. Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.